Thank you very much, Julia, for a wonderful presentation. Our next speaker today is Louise Allison Cort. Louise Cort is curator for ceramics at the Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution. Her interests include historical and contemporary ceramics in not only Japan, but also Southeast Asia and South Asia, as well as Japanese baskets and textiles, and works related to the Japanese tea ceremony. She is author of Shigaraki, Potter's Valley, published in 1979 and reprinted in 2000. In 2008, she prepared the online catalog, Ceramics in Mainland Southeast Asia, Collections in the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, along with George Ashley Williams IV and David P. Refus. Her other book-length publications include Isamu no Guchi and Modern Japanese Ceramics, A Close Embrace of the Earth, which she wrote with Bert Winther Tamaki in 2003. Also, Asian Traditions in Clay, with Anne Gunter and Masume Farhad in 2000. A Basket Maker in Rural Japan with Nakamura Kenji in 1995. Joined Colors, Decoration and Meaning in Chinese Porcelain with Jan Stewart in 1994. And Seto and Mino Ceramics in 1992. Today she is going to be speaking to us about the fantastic array of ceramics in Harry Packard's collection, which is one of the strongest areas of the collection and is, I think, up until now quite underappreciated, and she will do a wonderful job of describing it to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead, and thank you, Julia, for filling in many questions that I had about Harry Packard as I was preparing this talk. Information that you gave helped me understand better the framework for this amazing collection that we see samples of on view in the Metropolitan Galleries now. I have to admit, though, that at the same time as I appreciate the wonderful exhibition that's on view that Sinead and Masuko have organized, and Joyce, I also was somewhat not exactly disappointed, but not surprised when I walked through the exhibition for the first time at the New Year. And I'm showing you intentionally the photographs I took at that time, knowing that I was going to be preparing this talk, and trying to wrap my mind around what I thought of Harry Packard's collection of ceramics as it was on view. It was, in a strange way, very familiar. And it wasn't because I had known the Packard collection well in detail, but it is as though the categories of ceramics that are on view in the Packard collection are categories that were altogether well known. I was looking perhaps for things that would surprise me, and instead I found, yes, I know this material over and over again. Julia already showed you the Jomon pot. The collection also includes this remarkable group of late Jomon period, late Neolithic figural sculpture called dogu, and a wonderful pot from the subsequent Bronze Age, the Yayoi period. It includes the familiar, to me, sueware and sanage-ware, the early stonewares of Japan, both intentionally glazed and accidentally glazed. And of course, it includes the medieval ceramics, including the shigaraki jar that Harry Packard collected. Going on, it includes the familiar teawares of the Mino area made in the late 16th century as the shino dish, and early 17th century, oribe dish, the great Mino wares that are familiar to all of us, I think. Finally, it incorporates some of the great examples of Kyushu porcelain from the Arita region that are in American collections, both this large dish that Julia already showed and smaller pieces such as this bottle, as well as one of my favorite pieces, this dish with a design of a long-necked bird. At the same time, it includes some pieces that were and are still rather obscure within the understanding of Japanese ceramics. This mid-18th century piece from the island of Shikoku, the so-called Gennai ware. And finally, a wonderful selection of what generally would be known as folk art pottery from the 19th century kilns in Seto, a variety of dishes made for use in local restaurants and households. I realized gradually, as I was looking at the collection in the galleries that day, and then as I was thinking about it later, that the reason I was not surprised is that the Packard Collection really lays out in a very systematic way what we think of, or might think of, as the canon of mainstream categories of Japanese ceramics, the categories that all museums and many private collectors strive to address in their own collecting. And I realized, moreover, that Harry Packard was present in Japan at the time this canon was created, in the immediate post-war years in the late 40s and 50s and 60s, when what we think of now as the flow of Japanese ceramics over time was categorized in a new way, a way in which Harry Packard actively participated. I came across, first of all, I was assured by Julia when I contacted her that the Packard Collection, as it came to the Met, was the collection that he put together. There was no negotiating on the part of the Met curators. Yes, we'll take this. No, we don't want that. It was, here it is. This is my idea of what it is, and I now understand better from Julia's talk how that came to be. As I was looking around for information on Harry Packard as a collector, I came across a book that was published in Japanese in 1993, posthumously, in Japanese, called Record of Collecting Japanese Art, Nihon Bijutsu Shushuki, based on 2 series of essays that he had published in Japanese journals in 1966 and then again in 1976, that told a lot of the anecdotes that he thought important about his collecting and his encounters with categories of Japanese art, not only ceramics, but painting and sculpture as well. And I was led by reading some of his essays in that book to pull back off my shelf a book that I hadn't looked at in many years, published by the Oakland Art Museum in 1961, a book called Japanese Ceramics from Ancient to Modern Times. In a sense, that's exactly what the Packard Collection's laying out in the Met galleries. But I realized as I looked back at that exhibition, which ostensibly was organized by a Japanese curator, well-known curator of ceramics, that Harry Packard lay behind that project, and that many of the pieces in the Oakland exhibition were from his own collection. And I now understand more about how they came to be at the Oakland Museum as well. So using these 2 sources of information, I realized that by 1961, Harry Packard was already very actively engaged in introducing American audiences to his notion of the history of Japanese ceramics from ancient to modern times, in part as he formed it himself, in part as he absorbed it from the activities of other dealers and collectors and museum curators who were actively engaged in the same project when he was in Japan in the 50s and 60s. Today I'm going to look at just 3 of the groups of ceramics that Harry Packard was involved in identifying as categories of Japanese ceramics worthy of collecting and exhibiting. And they will be the Jomon ceramics, the Neolithic ceramics, medieval stoneware, the stoneware jars from roughly the 12th to the 16th century, and then finally the porcelain from the ancient Japanese province of Hizen, sometimes better known by association with the town where it was made, the town of Arita. But this porcelain that was known at the time Harry Packard was collecting it as shoki Imari, early Imari ware. So it has a multiple of ways of being addressed. In these 3 groups, I realized that the common themes that tied them together, or one common theme that tied them together, was the fact that at the time that Harry was looking at these pieces and selecting his choices among them, there was an emerging role of archaeology in helping to define an understanding of Japanese ceramics. Until the post-war era, Japanese ceramics had really been a field of connoisseurship. But with the rise of archaeology in the post-war rebuilding area, as Japan was engaged in rebuilding its infrastructure and building new infrastructure, building railroads and water systems and so forth, ceramics came to light in a new way that changed the way people looked at them. And I'll go back to this subject in a minute. And the second theme that I realized was very important to Harry Packard as a collector of Japanese ceramics was the importance of ceramics as a medium for painting. Through pursuing these 2 aspects of ceramics as they were becoming understood in the 50s and 60s, Harry Packard participated in the discovery of new categories of ceramics to collect, to own, to exhibit, and he, in his activities, helped to establish them within the mainstream of Japanese art and creating the kinds of acceptance we have nowadays for those types of ceramics that are on view in the Met's galleries. There are 4 people that I'll be referring to in the course of talking about these 3 categories of ceramics that Harry Packard collected. In addition to him, I'll be talking about the Japanese painter Okamoto Taro, the photographer Domon Ken, and the archaeologist Mikami Tsugio. And when I pulled together the birth dates for these, birth and death dates for these 4 men, I realized how closely their lives were aligned in terms of chronology. They were active on the same stage at the same time, and interactive perhaps in ways that they may not have even realized. So let's look first at the Jomon wares of prehistoric Japan. Okamoto Taro, the painter, was trained in Paris in the 1930s and was closely associated with surrealist painters. But when he came home to Japan, he was engaged with a discovery, and let me go ahead to this image, a discovery of aspects of Japan that he had been completely unfamiliar with. Chief among them was the discovery at the Tokyo National Museum of the prehistoric late Jomon figures called dogu. And he went to the museum in the days when it was easy to do so and went into storage with his camera and took his own photographs of these clay sculptural figures. As a result, if one knows that this was part of his early rediscovery for himself of what Japan was all about, And if one knows that he published in the mid-1950s a book of his photographs called Mysteries of Japan, or Shimpi Nihon, then the design that he created, the very familiar design to many people, for the Osaka Expo 70 of the landmark central sculpture called Tower of the Sun, is not such a surprise. One can see in the images, the facial images that he built into this towering sculpture, a lot of his engagement and fascination with the faces of the prehistoric Japanese figurines. So some of Harry Packard's sculptural figures in this context look very familiar. I'll show you 3 of them close up. Now not in my quick snapshots in the gallery, but in the professional photographs provided by the Met. This was one that was in the Oakland Museum exhibition I was interested to discover. In other words, it was interesting to know, for many of us, how long some of these iconic ceramics have been familiar to us through a series of presentations. Finally, this figure. The second category I'd like to touch upon is the category of medieval Japanese ceramics, what was known in the 50s and 60s and 70s when I was a student, as known as the 6 old kilns. This was a category of ceramics that was identified by counting the sources for medieval ceramics that were familiar to people at the time. Sources that became understood in a different way with the post-war advance of archaeology in advance of the rebuilding of the countryside of Japan. Kiln sites were uncovered, kiln sites were excavated, and this created a huge appetite among the collectors, museum dealers, museum curators, and dealers in Japan for medieval ceramic objects. Dealers scoured the countryside, went out into barns, and asked farmers whether they had any old jars around, and bought them up, cleaned them up, put them in their galleries in Tokyo and Kyoto and Osaka, and began to create a new market for this kind of material. But the image of these medieval storage jars was, in my opinion at least, created by the photographer Domon Ken. Domon created the very method of photographing them against a black background, and created this way of approaching the jars in a kind of frontal pose that I associate most readily with photography of Buddhist images. Indeed, Domon is known for his long-term work photographing the Buddhist imagery and architecture of temples throughout Japan, which he visited from the early 60s until the mid-70s, creating a series of beautiful books illustrated with his black and white photography of very close details of Buddhist sculpture and Buddhist architecture. Here, I'm going to show you 2 from his study of the temple Muroji, south of Kyoto. And I don't think I'm the only person who, when I started visiting Japan as a student of Japanese art, found that whenever I visited a Buddhist temple, I was looking at it through Domon Ken's eyes. These images were already familiar in books translated with English texts, and gave us a way of seeing Buddhist art that was new. But what distinguished Domon's work as a photographer is that he also was very engaged. He was a radical student who was thrown out of university in the 1930s for his political activities. When he returned to photography after the war, he was very engaged in photographing not only ancient temples, but the lives of ordinary Japanese people in the very difficult, lean years following the war, studies of Hiroshima and other places. And a quote from him, in a sense, ties together how he approached all of the images that he captured with his camera, not only the children of impoverished provincial towns, but the beautiful images of Heian period that survived in Buddhist temples, and the jars of shigaraki. He wrote, "I am involved with the social realities of today at the same time that I am involved with the traditions and classical culture of Nara and Kyoto." And he could have added shigaraki. And these two involvements are linked by their common search for the point in which they are related to the fate of the people, the anger, the sadness, the joys of the Japanese people. When Domonken in the mid-1960s was commissioned to prepare a book of portraits of shigaraki storage jars, commissioned by one of the Kyoto dealers who had searched out many of these jars in the countryside, he zoomed in on them with the same kind of attention to detail that he had followed in his studies of Buddhist sculpture, capturing the mood of the sculpting of the pieces, the chance transformations by the firing process, as in this jar with a fragment of another jar stuck to it by the firing process, or this marvelous study of the multiple layers of ash that landed on the shoulder of a jar, whose neck was completely broken off in the course of use over many centuries in farmers' barns. Another quote from Domon helps to explain how it was that he chose this way of looking at the shigaraki jars. He was described as, his method of photographing his temple studies was described as staying at the location for a time before taking the first photo. He would then begin photographing based not on a systematic scholarly approach to the subject, but based on how his feelings toward the subjects moved him to record them. And this reminded me, in an uncanny way, of one of the topics that Harry Packard addressed in his series of essays talking about his own formation as a collector and connoisseur of Japanese art. He talked about his very close and admiring relationship to Shimada Shujiro, the great historian of Japanese and Chinese painting. And he wrote that Shimada taught him to first feel and be moved by the work of art that was at issue, first allow plenty of time to have an emotional reaction to it, and only then to turn back and to engage in analysis. And I think that was very much the way that Domon Ken approached his photography. Another aspect of Domon Ken's photography of shigaraki jars that is of great interest to me is how, through modern, and in this case color photography, not the black and white that he saved for his temple studies, Domon Ken, in a way, recreated or interpreted the Japanese way of looking at and responding emotionally to ceramics. An approach to ceramics that begins in Japan in the 16th century and is recorded in great details in the diaries that people kept in the 16th century of their encounters in tea ceremonies with certain ceramics. These tea diaries write in tremendous detail about the interesting flaws and idiosyncrasies that the viewers found in the ceramics that were used to prepare tea for them or were exhibited in the tea room. And I feel in Domon Ken's close encounter with the crackled, crusty surface of this shigaraki jar and the nuances of its color, that he is engaged in the same kind of looking that by then was very deeply ingrained in Japanese aesthetic culture. And he, by bringing these jars back into that way of looking, brought them into the mainstream of Japanese collecting. So here is Harry Packard's shigaraki jar, the one that's on view in the gallery. This is the image provided by the Met photographer, and I was somewhat amused to see that this jar, as indeed was the case for many medieval jars acquired by American museums and collectors, was photographed exactly in the way Domon Ken established, against a black background. Harry also collected another medieval jar, and this was really his prize. This is also on view in the gallery, a jar from Tamba, the kilns of Tamba, west of Kyoto in central Honshu. And he told in his series of essays a wonderful and I guess rather Harry-like story about this jar. He was a very close friend with an Osaka dealer named Sera. And he first saw this Tamba jar when Sera showed it to him and said that he had bought it for 250,000 yen, which in that time, in the early 1950s, I believe, or early 1960s, forget exactly what the year was still calculated at the rate of 360 yen to $1. So 250,000 yen was approximately $700. Harry Packard immediately was smitten by this jar. He asked Sarah to sell it to him. Sarah said, "I'll sell it to you for 700,000 yen." In other words, 3 times the price, roughly. Packard objected that this was unreasonable, and Sarah said, "Okay, here's a deal. You pay me your 250,000 yen now, and when you realize this jar is really worth 700,000 yen, you pay me the rest." In the ensuing year, Harry Packard promoted this jar, which he dearly loved, and it appeared in no fewer than 3 different books on Japanese ceramics. This was just at the time that, as part of this canonizing project, new series on Japanese ceramics were being published. Although these series were illustrated mostly with black and white photography at the time, it was still very expensive to do color illustrated books. But the Tamba jar managed to appear in no fewer than 3 different catalogs in color. So something like a year after Harry Packard acquired this jar, a very famous Tokyo dealer approached him at the time that the jar was on view in an exhibition that was called The 100 Greatest Japanese Ceramics. And it had appeared in color in that collection catalog. And the dealer offered Harry Packard 1,500,000 yen for his Tamba jar. At that moment, Harry Packard realized that he owed some money to Mr. Sera, so he sold them some things and scraped up some money and went back and paid the remainder. So his sense of the importance of things was Sarah's sense of the eventual capitulation of Packard was confirmed, but Packard's wily way of dealing was also perhaps recorded in this negotiation. Finally, the third category is the early Imari or Shoki Imari ware, the ware associated with early modern Japan in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And I realized as I looked over the records of the Packard Collection that were kindly provided to me by Sinead that Packard's real passion was this Shoki Imari porcelain. Counting up the kinds of wares that he collected we can find that he had approximately 22 prehistoric wares, jomon and otherwise, 7 medieval wares, about 18 tea wares, including Shino and Oribe ware, about 20 of the 19th century seto plates. But he had no less than 154 early Imari or Imari porcelain pieces, including many, many sets of pieces. So this was clearly the focus of his passion for Japanese ceramics and the aspect of Japanese ceramics he thought deserved the most attention. Now, just at the time that he was forming his collection, archaeology began to address the question of ceramic production in the town of Arita. And in particular, beginning in 1975, there was a very important excavation of a kiln known as Tengu Dani. This excavation was carried out by the archaeologist Mikami Tsugio, who was teaching then at Tokyo University, who would also teach eventually at Gakushuin University, and would work for Idemitsu Museum, a very distinguished archaeologist who also spent a lot of time working on ceramics in the Near East, in the Egyptian site of Fustat in Old Cairo. He was very knowledgeable in Chinese ceramics as well. So he investigated the production at the Tengudani kiln site in Arita with a very wide vision of how it fit into Asian ceramic history. This site was important because it was associated in the lore of the town of Arita with a figure named Ri Sampei, giving his Japanese pronunciation of his Korean name, one of the immigrant Korean potters who was brought to the town of Arita and settled there by the local daimyo and given support to set up production of ceramics. For the first decade or more, however, ceramic production was limited to stoneware, but it was said to be Ri Sampei who in the year 1616 discovered in Arita itself a source of clay to make porcelain. And this white-bodied, beautiful, heretofore unattainable ceramic was for the first time able to be made in Japan rather than imported from China and Korea. And the Tengudani kiln site was said to be the site where Ri Sampei then built a kiln and began making Arita porcelain. But the important dimension that archaeology brought to the excavation of this legend, as it were, was its complexity, because it was found that on the Tengudani kiln site there were no fewer than 5 kilns layered on top of one another. In addition to photographs like this, people interested in Arita ceramics and early Imari ceramics became used to the kinds of diagrams that were made by archaeologists to record their finds. These diagrams that recorded a much more complex story than anyone had realized theretofore. And finally, in the publication of the Tengudani kiln site excavation in 1972, collectors and connoisseurs came to grips with a new kind of ceramic. This was not the beautiful heirloom in pristine condition. It was the stained, battered, discarded ceramics that came out of kiln sites that were not beautiful in the same way, but were full of information. And in particular, they were challenging, almost mocking, because so often they did not match in their content the kinds of ceramics that had been passed down as being Arita ceramics. So new challenges were laid down to collectors and museum curators. According to Packard, the kinds of ceramics made at the Arita kilns, especially the early Arita kilns, were thought of until that time as folk art because of their relative coarseness. And mainstream dealers were interested instead in works like the Nabeshima dish on the left, the Kutani-style dish on the right, both of which also came as part of Packard's collection. And this early Hizenware was seen as rather coarse and folksy, along with, I was very interested to find, medieval Japanese ceramics as well. In other words, in the 50s and 60s, these were not deemed of the highest quality, not worth collecting. They were collected mainly at that time by Yanagi Soetsu and other people involved with the folk craft movement who put a positive value on these things used by ordinary people in everyday life. They were often, according to Harry Packard, confused as Korean ceramics or mixed in with other ceramics of very different sources. Packard began collecting early Imari ware in 1958-59, again through his dealer friend from Osaka, Sarah Yosuke. Sarah was putting together an exhibition of this material, and Packard visited at the time the material was laid out in preparation for the exhibition and became immediately fascinated with it and turned his collecting attention to it. This piece, now in the Met Collection, is one of the very first pieces he bought from Sarah, a hanging vase formed in a long rectangular shape. There's a hole in the back for hanging this against a pillar in a reception room. And in his volume of essays, Packard writes that one Japanese art historian who was a close friend of his, who also deeply appreciated this kind of Arita porcelain ware, said that the reason for his appreciation lay in the fact that the decoration on these early Imari wares was not standardized, was not repetitive, that in its individuality it was close to pure painting. And here we even see this composition of a girl playing with a kite, painted on a rectangular surface that is very close to the layout of a hanging scroll. Another of my favorites of this early Imari style is this lone Chinese-style man in the middle of a big round dish. I think it was this way in which Arita porcelain, early Imari porcelain, Hizen porcelain, call it what we will, was a presentation of painting on a ceramic surface, was what engaged Harry Packard in this fervid collection of this material. He wrote in his essays that he eventually realized that early Arita porcelain involved not just these relatively simple pieces, but quite elaborate ones, like the large dish. At the same time, though, I think, to me, what makes this dish wonderful is my sense that there is accident incorporated into the final, quite complex decoration. If you look closely, you can see that there's one kind of brushwork in the representation of this marvelous tree whose boughs bend to accommodate the roof of the temple nearby. And there's a second kind of brushwork in the decoration of the rim and some of the clouds and even in the temple itself. And I think the key to this relationship is in these birds. I see these birds as someone, unfortunately, dropping some blobs of cobalt pigment onto the dish just when they'd finished a lot of the decoration. They suddenly had to find a way to deal with this without losing the whole day's effort, and they realized that the blobs of cobalt could be made to look like long-tailed birds, very large long-tailed birds sitting in the upper branches of this tree. And so while this is a much more complex and large-scale piece, it maintains this sense that the Japanese art historian praised, this sense of individual addressing of how to decorate a particular object. Another piece in the Packard collection Actually, it has a story of its own that evolved last summer when I was fortunate to be able to visit, along with Masako Watanabe, of the Packard Collection in storage at the Met, bringing with me a student of the archaeologist Mikami Tsugio, a man named Ohashi Koji, who has gone on to have his own distinguished career as a scholar of early Ardita porcelain. And he came to look at the porcelain pieces in the Packard Collection. When he came to this piece, he was absolutely dumbfounded. He said, "This is the piece I've been looking for my entire career." It's actually a set of dishes. It comes in the earliest known inscribed box for a set of Ardita porcelain, a box that is dated to the year 1639. This piece, this set of 10 pieces, had been published in old black and white photographs in numerous Japanese volumes, but no one knew where the actual pieces were until Mr. Ohashi came to see Harry Packard's collection at the Met last summer. So there's a sense in which even from the afterlife, Harry Packard is somehow controlling these encounters with his collection in a very interesting way. Going back to this provincial product of the Gennai kilns on the island of Shikoku, Kagawa Prefecture, the old Sanuki province, reminded me, when I looked at it in the galleries, of my single encounter with Harry Packard himself. When he visited the Freer Gallery, must have been sometime in the 1980s, to look around our ceramic storage. And he told me at that time of how much emphasis and value he placed on visiting the provinces, getting out of Kyoto and Nara and Osaka and Tokyo, and seeing what there was to find in the rafters of a temple in Yamaguchi or in the old storehouses of small-scale dealers on the island of Shikoku, where he found this dish. And indeed, that way of approaching the market for antiques, not skimming off the top, but delving deep into what was available, understanding what was available, was, I think, a great contribution of Harry Packard's collecting methodology. Finally, I close my remarks by showing you one of my favorite pieces from his collection, one that's on view in the galleries, one of those 19th century Seto plates that I feel was painted by someone in the Seto workshop who had the job of decorating these dishes that were made for local restaurants and ordinary homes just to serve dishes for meals and to accompany drinking. I imagine that the painter was coming to the end of the day and thinking about going out and having something to eat and a nice drink of sake to come with it, and he covered the dish in a very random way with a big sake bottle, with the character for sake, with a cup that might be a cup for rice or a cup for drinking or both, a grater for grating some radish to accompany the grilled fish that he was thinking of eating along with his sake, and a scoop for scooping rice out of the tub of rice. These wonderful Seto dishes have paintings of this sort on them, but this one, to me, is truly exceptional. Looking at the Packard Collection as it's today housed in the Metropolitan, I think it's an apt demonstration of the truism that one role of a museum is to preserve these kinds of moments in collecting. Of course, I think the main role is to enable the visitor to the museum to have a face-to-face encounter with this dish or the Neolithic sculpture or any one of the pieces in the Packard Collection. But at the same time, having the Packard Collection as it was shaped, dictated by Harry Packard, kept intact in the Metropolitan Museum, now ensures that this moment of the formation of a canon of Japanese ceramics in the 50s and 60s is preserved for our understanding and for future understanding. It's no longer exactly what we might call the canon of ceramics today, but it gives us a vast wealth of painted images in particular to pursue and enjoy. Thank you.